And now over to Toby, who's going to talk about some of the practicalities that he has experienced in his growing of wheat in Sheffield.
And is my slide showing?
Not yet. Yeah, it's
showing now. Great. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Camilla. So yeah, my name's Toby Hyam. I live near Sky Edge. I've lived there for about 10 years, and I've always grown stuff on allotments and in small gardens in cities, and I began to sort of question why it was so hard to get hold of some cereals to try out just to grow a few whole grains. And as I began to sort of look into it, I couldn't believe how difficult it was just to find the basic seed stock to have a go. And I'm also interested just in the things that are around us that we don't necessarily question very much. And as I began to look into wheat and flour in the UK, I had a series of terrible shocks, really. I didn't realise that there were 4 additives put into flour at the time, that those didn't require to be labelled. And I discovered the Real Bread campaign. I saw someone's asked a question about that. Absolutely fundamental if you want to understand how industrialised our flour production system is. It's a really good starting point is to join the Real Bread campaign and to look at some of their resources online. So I went through this sort of discovery process, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I've done since, what I've learned, and some of the things I'd like to achieve. I'm very much an amateur. I have another life, so I've got other things to do. This is what I do in my spare time. So it's not necessarily systematically recorded or even very scientific at all. It's me just having a few goes, failing quite a lot, and learning a few things as I go along. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to just show a few slides as I go along, which just illustrates some of what I'm doing. But essentially, I did eventually find a small amount of seed from an organisation in London called the Brockwell Bay. They were distributing some varieties of heritage cereals, wheat in particular. And I began, you basically get a few grams, that's maybe 60 seeds, you plant them, and you hopefully get maybe half a kilogram at the end of that. And then you plant that half a kilogram, and the next season you might get 5-6 kilograms. So, and obviously there's lots of variables along the way. So essentially, over the last sort of 8-9 years, I've been trying out different seeds, learning a bit more as I go along, trying to find different sources of particularly wheat, but I've also been experimenting with oats, barley, and I've grown a bit of rye as well. And this is 2 different winter wheats that are growing here in a series of beds. This is from 2019, and there'll be some more shots of this later on. But if I'd had a successful harvest this year, which I didn't, I would have got nearly 100 kilograms of wheat grain from that. So one of my sort of targets is what sort of quantity of grain and therefore how much flour could I actually make from a relatively small allotment area. Again, these are more shots as the grain progresses. You can see it growing in height. So with a winter wheat like this is probably around late April, early May, about equivalent to this time of year. You can see it's making quite good progress. And again, taken from another perspective, the wheat's now about 3.5 feet high. One of the characteristics of this type of these types of heritage wheats is that the wheats that you saw in Ruth's picture have all been hybridized, because since the Green Revolution, wheat is grown on a large scale to be 2.5 feet, as basically as short as possible. So it's standardized for combine harvesting. The theory is that more of the energy of the plant goes into increasing the yield if it's smaller. But the history is that if you were walking around Britain at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, you'd be walking past wheat fields where wheat is growing hugely varied across the country, and in some cases 5 feet, 5.5 feet in height. So the sound, the look and feel of the environment in which wheat was grown was totally different. And one of the things I really found quite powerful when I was growing this is just the sound of a very small amount of wheat in the wind is a really beautiful thing. And it's something that you've pretty much lost because of a different way of growing things. Now that's just an aesthetic consideration, but there are lots of arguments and issues over the quality, the taste of some of these early varieties of wheat. And there's a very interesting area of work around the notion of land races, where people have saved their seed. Seed has adapted to a particular environment, and that's become, if you like, a variety that adapts. It's adaptive to the environment in which you're growing it. And our modern system of agriculture has pretty much banned land races or made it very difficult for growers and farmers to pursue that approach. But that is the approach, that basic of saving your seed and that seed adapting to the environment, is how for tens of thousands of years we've fed human beings. And it seems a terrible thing just to throw away that thought process and also that sort of way of working, simply because we believe we can produce food in a way that's more efficient by putting massive amounts of input into that and actually selling the seed and making farmers very much slaves to an industrialized food production system. So you start to learn some of the politics of why we don't have tall wheats. It isn't just an aesthetic issue. There is a lot of science and a lot of socio-political sort of ideas behind why this has changed. Remember, this is one of the crops that feeds the world. You know, with rice, it's absolutely a fundamental piece. So the fact that there is so much, it's not a surprise that there should be so much politics around it. Okay, another shot again. Obviously there's some beans and other things there, but you can see the wheat growing. The ears have appeared on it at this point, still not at maximum height. Here you can see, so lots of heritage wheats have what are known as awns, the long spiky bits that come out of the ear, which are characteristic of barley, but actually were characteristic of lots of different types of heritage wheats as well. And this is multiple varieties of wheat. This is QY quality and yield. This was developed by Martin Wolf at Wakelands. Martin was a pioneer of encouraging diversity in cereal production, and he developed a lot of time, put investment into a farm at Wakelands in Suffolk, which he experimented with a whole series of systems and different types of multi-species wheat production. And I was lucky enough to go and visit it a couple of years ago. Martin died last year, unfortunately, but a really tremendous person who really had a strong scientific understanding of the importance of diversity in cereal crop production. So here's a little moving image just to see what it looks like, because it's really quite a powerful thing. I find this quite moving to see wheat swaying around, not falling down. It does fall down sometimes, but that's when we have hailstorms in July. Of course, we have had them, but this is how it sort of behaves and moves around. This is lodging. So when you have that type of storm, this is what can happen. This is one of the reasons why they hybridized it, because for mechanical combining, you've lost that basically. Actually, if you're doing it by hand, even if you're using older machinery, it is possible for that to ripen, for you to get yield from it. So it's very interesting if you talk to or read small American sort of market gardeners and small scale whole grain producers. They believe you can still manage ripened lodged wheat. It can be usable, so it is possible to use. This is what it looks like when it ripens, and again, it gives you a feel for sort of color. Of course, the way this is done, when people do this commercially, you use a moisture content tester to test the right moment to pick it, and of course, a combine harvester combines threshing and reaping process. In the old days, the way I do it, you cut it, you stack it, you allow the wind to dry it, and if you can put it inside, you put it inside. If you can cover it, you cover it, but you want the air to get to it and you want it to dry out. And then people used to use basically a bite test to test how hard the grain is before it goes from a sort of milky stage to a hard stage. And that's the point which you either store it and keep it dry, or you grind it. Grain like this will last a year quite happily, but once you grind it, and if you grind it as whole wheat, it'll last 3 months. So you want to really grind it close to when you're going to use it, and that's because the oils in the endosperm will deteriorate and go bitter over time. Again, more shots of ripened wheat, close-ups. The tools I use for cutting. This is what it looks like. Unfortunately, when you get your friends and neighbors to help, it's not as organized a process as I would like to do it, and that's one of the things I'm probably going to change. Is I'm trying to retain as much of the straw for thatching, to experiment with using straw in a productive way, and it doesn't help if people aren't cutting it absolutely systematically. So you can see it's a little bit untidy, which I'd like to avoid in the future. Then you're bundling them into sheaves, and of course, you know, just a reminder, we're doing this in Sheffield. It's named after effectively a place where wheat was grown for a long time in the valleys here, and just the whole notion of sheaves of wheat being lain out to dry, and then a threshing period which in a pre-industrialized format would have gone from the autumn right into the winter, and people had been threshing in barns for quite a long time. This is my thresher, which moving beyond flailing, and this was just a prototype which I'm still adapting now. It's a bike-powered thresher. I'm not quite sure how many revolutions a minute it does work, but there's some improvements I'm trying to make to it. I think I've got a little in motion. Won't spend too long on that. This is a sort of big wheat stack. Once it's dried out, this was just about to be threshed at this point. And I got about 40 kilograms of grain from that crop. It's a lot less than I hoped to get. I hoped to get about 100 kilograms. And the storms that we had really affected my yield. My threshing machine wasn't as efficient as it could be, so I lost some grain in the threshing process. All of those things I think I can improve. This is the gleanings. So you find pieces, ears of wheat on the ground, you pick them up, and you get your relatives and family to manage them. And this is just taking them off the ear, and then before the winnowing process, where you separate the chaff from the grain. This is a community cob oven that was made with soil that we dug up from the ground, and again, was 30 people did this over a few weekends a few years ago, and then we've been able to bake bread from some of the wheat that we've grown. And this is a sad story of one of the many things that go wrong. This is trying to scale up the production to an area of about half an acre in Friendsfield, the regather field. And the reason why this crop failed is really self-evident. This is taken at about 8 o'clock in the morning. the frost is still quite hard on the grass, it's still in the furrows. And unfortunately, it was the only day that I could drill. I'm using a 1920s grain drill that takes 1.5 kilos of grain. The way it works is as you take it down the soil, there's a little furrow, drops the seed through the furrow, and the soil should fall back over it. That didn't happen because the ground was so hard. And what I believe happened was the birds essentially got pretty much the whole crop. I found a few germinated wheat plants, but really very, very few. So, and this was because we were planting too late, really right at the end of the season. So this is a winter wheat going in, not even at the end of October, it's the first week of November, which is the absolute last time that you should be planting. And really what I think I've learned is I'm not going to be planting that late again. I think it has to be earlier. And again, you've got to pick the optimum conditions to do that. Just a final sort of shot, this is Bologna. I went to a conference on heritage wheat, and there were about 225 varieties of wheat that had been grown for the conference in advance, sent in by people from all over the world. And it's really just to flag up that I've grown maybe half a dozen heritage varieties of wheat. There's a couple I've settled on now. I'm experimenting with one spring wheat, but really winter wheat is the main thing that I'm interested in. But there are people all over the world who care about landrace wheats, about locally saved, and developed and evolved and adapted wheats. It's a very small group of people, but it is a global movement. And I think if we care about our food security and we care about food production, then wheat is actually a very, very important part of that. And understanding how far we've come from a system that in the early 20th century was still really well understood. There was still lots of skills around. There was small scale machinery around. We've lost so much of that expertise. And I firmly believe we need to recapture some of that at the same time as working hard to find more sustainable ways to produce wheat on a large scale. So I hope that just gives you a little insight into what I've done. I'm happy to answer some questions and to share what little knowledge that I've gained as much as I can. And I've done a reading list as well. So I've given this to Johnny. So there's just a few books that I found useful. A few of them American, but that's where quite a lot of this sort of work has gone on. And I think all of this helps you build an understanding of finding, growing, and processing heritage wheats.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we could all, I think we could have a little unmute, everyone unmute, and we can have a little round of applause for all of the speakers. It's,
Yay.